The People's Organization for Progress was created in 1983, and it was created by those of us who had been student activists in high school in 1970, 71. We had graduated, we had gone on to college. Most of us had been college student activists at Princeton. I was one of the organizers of the anti-apartheid movement to get Princeton to divest its stocks from companies that were doing business with South Africa. But when we graduated from college, we wanted to continue our activism. Even though, we are the adults now and married, children, jobs, we still wanted to be politically active. And we wanted to have something that was a little more aggressive than the organizations that were already on the scene. And so we began to have some discussions. In 1982, we began to meet on a monthly basis, have these political discussions. So we decided that we would form an organization, that organization would be called the People's Organization for Progress. And we drafted a constitution for the People's Organization for Progress. And we ratified that constitution on August 28th, 1983, which happened to be the anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington. So POP has been in existence since 1983, and it's a grassroots, all-volunteer organization that works for racial, social, economic justice, and peace.
We can actually keep rolling, actually, as long as the files aren't too loud. Okay.
Why is POP involved in the board, and what will you hope it will accomplish?
Which board?
The CIS board. I'm guessing the Newark Civilian Complaint Review Board.
Okay. Well,
I'm sorry. And actually, first, can you tell us what the National Civilian Complaint Review Board is?
Okay.
And then how was POP involved in it?
Right. Police review boards have a history, at least in this contemporary era, going back to the mid-'60s. Police brutality was at epidemic proportions. See, the police brutality that people are experiencing today has historical roots. One of the reasons why African American, Latino, Native American, Asian American, other people of color are victims of police brutality overwhelmingly is because the police have their origins in police forces and slave patrols that were formed during the era of slavery in the United States. In fact, it's so funny, I actually heard Commissioner Bratton, the commissioner of the New York Police Department, give a talk, and actually he had to talk about how the New York police force had its origins in the slave patrols that existed in New York City. Because remember, slavery wasn't just in the South, it was a national institution. There was slavery right here in New Jersey. And people didn't want to be slaves. So slaves were always rebelling, always running away. So they had to form armed units to put down rebellions, to return runaway slaves. In fact, one of the provisions of the Constitution of the United States is actually a protection that was included for the return of property, and that property was chattel slaves, because they would run from the South to the North, and a lot of times they wouldn't be returned to the South. So, there was a demand to have our property returned. So modern police, if you read a book by Herbert Apteker called Slave Rebellions in Colonial America, Apteker states that modern police forces as we know them today have their origins in slavery and in slave patrols and other armed bands. So does the National Guard, because this was one of the major elements of domestic unrest. The other element was labor. Although you had free labor, there were often labor disturbances because labor would strike, labor would protest. The the conditions between being a chattel slave and an indentured servant weren't all that different, except for the fact that indentured servitude was for a finite period, usually 7 years, roughly 7 years, more or less. And so we have this history during slavery, in the period after slavery, in the 20th century, of police really being very brutal toward the formerly enslaved people. In fact, I can remember my grandfather telling me, talking about this problem, about police brutality. And it was police brutality that caused many of the rebellions. Many people don't know that from 1960 to 1972, there were more than 1,000 urban uprisings in the United States. People don't know that. They know about the Newark riot. They might know about the Detroit riot. Just in 1967 alone, there were 168 rebellions, and even more in 68 after Dr. King's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination. So in response to all this police brutality, people were saying we need some type of judicial apparatus to put these cops in check. So the first major effort to do this was in New York City. New York City formed its first police review board. This would be a board where people could bring complaints about the police. The board would review the complaints. If it found after its investigation that the complaints were valid, the board would issue some type of sanction against the police. So New York had the first one. As early as 1966, people in Newark, including the ACLU, which was in existence at that time, were demanding that a police review board be formed in Newark. So this is a demand that goes back half a century, 50 years, to form the police review board. So you have many cities now across the country who have these review boards where people can bring complaints about the police, and if they're lucky, there might be some sanction. More than not, the police review boards don't sanction the police, but in more recent times, they're beginning to step up to the plate a little bit more. So Pop had joined with others who made this demand, one being Amiri Baraka, the father of the current mayor of Newark, Ras Baraka. He was a major activist in this town in the 1960s. He played a major role in helping Ken Gibson, the first black mayor, being elected. And he himself was almost killed by the police. He was nearly beaten to death by the police in 1967. So he had an organization called the Committee for Unified Newark, and that organization for years raised the demand for a police review board, which continued until this time. And how ironic that the son of Amiri Baraka becomes the mayor and issues the first executive order in the 350-year history of Newark to form a police review board. And hopefully that review board will be up and running by the end of this year.
Wow. I think you answered 3 questions. You talked about the history of police brutality in Newark.
Right.
You spoke about how the Civilian Complaint Review Board came to be.
Right.
And you explained how POP became involved in it.
Yes.
What do you think it will take for police brutality to end in this nation?
Well, I think, I hate to be...
And if you could just restate the question in your answer.
Okay, what will it take to end police brutality in the United States? I think it'll take many things. Police brutality is a multidimensional problem, and it will require a multidimensional solution. But among all of those facets, among all of those dimensions, the most important thing is an organized constituency that keeps the pressure on municipal government to hold the police in check. Because you can have review boards and you can have laws. There are a lot of laws right now that, if the laws were really followed and implemented, should be able to check the police, but they don't. And that's why people have demanded a review board and other reforms. But even those reforms will not have a major impact unless there's organized protest in an ongoing way, because this problem is going to be around a long time. The problem of police brutality is deeply rooted in the problem of racism. There was a period in my lifetime when there were hardly any black policemen, period. And this country, because you know this country is the origin of racial apartheid. It didn't originate in South Africa and come to the U.S. It originated in the U.S. and went to South Africa. But I can remember when there were almost no black police officers on the Newark Police Department. And if there were black police officers, they couldn't arrest white people. They could only arrest black people. Now, this was like the law, the practice in the South. It was the unspoken practice in the North, because that's how Jim Crow differed between the North and the South. The North would posit itself as being against slavery and being against Jim Crow, and they didn't have a lot of these Jim Crow laws, but they had the practices nonetheless. They had the segregation and everything else. So as long as there's racism, and as long as police forces remain majority white and are hiring people who bring their racist baggage with them, we're gonna have this problem. But it's not just racism; it's more attitudes than racism. You know, because my grandfather once told me, he said, a black cop will beat you harder than a white cop will. Now, one might answer, why is that? Because to be on the police is not just about being black or white, it's about being blue. And they have to compensate, and they have to show their white colleagues that they are just as loyal and just as willing to use force against the indigenous population as the cops who don't live in these communities do. And that's one reform we need. There's a bill in the state legislature now which would require police to live in the communities where they work. And I think that would help a lot. You know, it's a multidimensional problem, but the biggest thing right now is that people have to organize and mobilize and stay mobilized to keep the pressure on, to let those in power know that, you know, folks are not going to stand for this behavior. And it's very interesting because just recently, the Newark Police Department, it was announced is going to be taken over by the federal government. The Newark Police Department was so bad that the Justice Department came in at the behest of the ACLU. There were so many police brutality cases. Justice Department came in, did an investigation, and said, we have to place a federal monitor over the Newark Police. It will not reform itself. They're going to do two things. One is a consent decree. A consent decree is simply a schedule of reforms that the local municipality agrees to implement regarding the police to combat the problems of police brutality and racial profiling and so forth. So there's going to be a consent decree, and there's going to be a federal monitor, and those are going to stay in place until the reforms have been implemented. Because the U.S. Justice Department investigation found three things. One is that the Newark police did violate people's constitutional rights. In their stop and frisks, 75% of the stop and frisks were deemed to be unconstitutional, that there was no good reason for them to stop and frisk these people. The other was discrimination. The overwhelming majority of those stopped and frisked were African Americans. So there was both violation of constitutional rights, racial discrimination. They found that there were cases where there was the unjustified use of excessive force, and they also found corruption. They found that certain units of the Newark police, the drug and gang units, were in fact taking the drugs and taking the money of the drug dealers and going and selling it themselves, or maybe using it themselves. And so the U.S. Attorney for New Jersey had a big press conference, and they announced this. And it's been very interesting over this last year, you know, because folks in the community know that People's Organization for Progress is one of the groups. We're not the only group. We're one of the groups that deal with this problem. And so we meet on a weekly basis. And so families come to us. In the year